to the podcast, 'Tis But a Scratch, Fact and Fiction about the Middle Ages. I'm your host, Professor Richard Abels. In past episodes, we've explored the legend and the historical reality behind two of Britain's most famous medieval figures, King Arthur and Robin Hood. Today, we are shifting our attention to the Iberian Peninsula to look at Spain's most famous medieval hero, Rodrigo Diaz de Vivar, better known as El Cid. And once again, we will be looking at the difference between legend and history. I'm delighted to have as my co-host a true expert on the Cid, Professor Nora Berend of the University of Cambridge in the UK. Professor Berend is perhaps best known for her distinguished scholarly work on Central Europe in the High Middle Ages. Her first book, At the Gate of Christendom, Jews, Muslims, and Pagans in quotation marks, in medieval Hungary, circa 1000 to circa 1300, was published by Cambridge University Press and was awarded the Gladstone Prize for Non-British History by the Royal Historical Society. For too long, historians of medieval England and Western Europe in general have tended to look no further east than the Elbe River, well, except perhaps to nod at the Balkan Crusades. But that's no longer the case, and it's due in large measure to the work of Professor Berend. But today we will be talking about her newest book, El Cid, The Life and Afterlife of a Medieval Mercenary, just out from the Pegasus Press. After reading a glowing review of the book by Michael Dierter in the Washington Post Book World, I knew that this would be an ideal subject for a podcast like 'Tis But a Scratch that contrasts popular ideas about the Middle Ages with their historical reality. So I invited Professor Berend to join me to talk about her book, and to my delight, she accepted. Nora, welcome to 'Tis But a Scratch. I'm so pleased to have you on the show. But before we begin, I'd like to congratulate you on writing a book of serious scholarship that is also a really good read. That's an all too rare accomplishment.
Thank you. Thank you very much, both for the invitation and for this very kind introduction.
Much of the book is really about the afterlife, about how Rodrigo Diaz has been transformed again and again over time. I think that for most of my listeners, people who are the general audience interested in the Middle Ages, and I think very much like most of the readers for your book, when they think of El Cid, and they probably don't think of Rodrigo Diaz, they think of El Cid, they have an image in mind. And that image was the image that was created, at least first, not in his lifetime, but after his death. So why don't we start with the legend of El Cid and what that image is, and then we will move back to the real person.
Okay. I guess that there isn't even one legend. There are several legends. I suppose a lot of Americans interested in history will have the image created by the film that featured Charlton Heston as El Cid. And that film, of course, has roots in all sorts of places in a way.
And the composite picture of the Cid that the movie's three screenplay writers wove from all these sources is summed up in a stirring movie trailer.
Among our people, we have a word for a warrior with a vision to be just and the courage to be merciful. We call such a man El Cid.
From the blood and conflict of medieval Spain came the greatest hero of all time. The beautiful Ximena de Gomez. Theirs was so great a love that the full fury of a cruel fate could not extinguish its passionate fire. Here, amid the pomp and the pageantry of the Spanish court, one man's unswerving loyalty enriched the splendor of chivalry. A man who knew the warmth of happiness and love. And yet before his fearless integrity, Even the king was humbled.
Do you swear that you had no part by way of design in King Sancho's death?
I swear it!
If you are forsworn, may you die such a death as your brother did, struck from behind by the hand of a traitor. Open the gates! For God, Alfonso, and for Spain!
God, Alfonso, and Spain!
In a mere 2 minutes, we learn that the Saracens dubbed Rodrigo El Cid as a term of honor for a warrior with the vision to be just and the courage to be merciful, that El Cid is a passionate and devoted lover, that he's a paragon of chivalry and unwavering loyalty, and that he is a man of such fearless integrity that he's willing even to call a king to account. The Cid of the movie is not merely the greatest hero of Spain, but in the words of the narrator, he is the greatest hero of all times. All of that set to the Academy Award-nominated music score by the Hungarian-born composer Miklos Rózsa. I just wanted to mention Rózsa for the Hungarian-Spanish connection. Now, from what I understand, the cinematic portrayal of Rodrigo Diaz actually owes a lot to a Spanish historian.
Ramon Menendez Pidal, who was a very important philologist and historian, and who spent a lot of his very long life working on texts about El Cid, was the historical advisor of the film. And his view, which really propagated the myth as true history, so unfortunately he took various medieval texts, and especially the epic poem Cantar or Poema de mi Cid, as a kind of authentic account. And he himself then added other layers of myth. This informed the film. This influenced the film very much. Of course, also the context of the making of the film, made in Franco's Spain.
At a time when Franco was comparing himself to El Cid, the Franco government pretty much pitched the project to producer Samuel Bronston, who had established his production company in Spain. The film was made in cooperation with the Spanish Ministry of Information and Tourism. In some ways, it was a Franco production.
And also made at the time of the Cold War. So the film is a kind of combination of medieval myth through the prism of Menendez Pidal, and messages about Franco as a kind of positive figure fighting for Spain and Europe, and of course the Bolsheviks and Republicans emerged in a sense as kind of the negative figures in the film.
That's really ironic, given that the final screenplay was largely written by two Hollywood blacklisted writers, Ben Bosman and Bernard Gordon. Both had been members of the American Communist Party in the early 1940s, and both had refused to name names to the House on Un-American Activities Committee.
So that film obviously is a combination of particular legends. It is very, very far from the historical Rodrigo. There are some very interesting kind of small details in how things got transformed. Because, for example, we see Charlton Heston grow a beard over time in exile, and probably people don't realize that that actually is a reference to the Cantar, where he takes an oath, he promises to not cut his beard before he's pardoned. The text is not evoked in the film, but clearly through Menendez Pidal, this kind of got into the film. On the other hand, the film, of course, cuts out a lot of the cantar, which would have been very alien for modern audiences and really not in sync with the kind of heroic Cid who is presented in the film. So we'll probably talk about this later in more detail. But the cantar, of course, has this very long section on the humiliation of his daughters. None of this is in the film. So it's the film is not true to even medieval legends. It is not true to any one particular legend. It creates a new one where Rodrigo is this man of peace who has recourse to violence as a last resort. Could not be further from either the historical Rodrigo or even the mythic Rodrigo of the poema.
I did wonder whether Franco was completely happy with Charlton Heston's portrayal of the Cid. The movie Cid is a far cry from being a Christian crusader. Rodrigo seeks to live in harmony and peace with his Muslim neighbors, and when he becomes the Lord of Valencia, he treats his Muslim subjects with respect. At the film's climax, the army he leads to fight for Spain against the Almoravid invaders includes Valencia's Muslims as well as Christian knights. How does that jibe with Franco's national Catholicism?
Franco both talked about his national Catholic movement as this new crusade and Reconquista, but at the same time, he actually relied on Muslims. So he had this Moroccan guard. He was the head of the army, the Spanish Army of Africa initially. That's how his military career started. And he retained this Moroccan guard and took them with him. They participated in the Civil War, and he also actually recruited Muslims from elsewhere. The war, the Francoist side of the war was also declared a jihad, and there were Muslims serving him. So I just wanted to add that because I think it's kind of it's interesting and complicates this.
It just shows you how complicated history really is. You go ahead and you try to make it into a simple story, and the complications keep on rising up, and they make the story really, really messy. But that's what I love about history. History is messy.
So maybe people who have read other works know other legends. So Corneille's play, which of course is still sometimes performed, has an almost Hamlet-like Rodrigo, who is torn between duty and love, so between honor and love. Again, has nothing to do with the historical Rodrigo, but it's a part of the legend that is incorporated, of course, into the film in some way, but again, changed because in the original play, in Corneille's play, this tension is really kind of the central element and really defines what the hero and heroine can do. So what Rodrigo and Jimena can do in order to try to save their honor. So this again is sort of somewhat changed and incorporated into the film, but kind of only as a partial thread in the whole story.
How would you characterize the popular image of the Cid when it comes to the relations between Christians and Muslims in medieval Spain? The character played by Charlton Heston, who's a great warrior. He defeats his opponent in a trial by combat early in the film, and he leads troops to victory. But how would you depict him in terms of this notion of a Spain divided religiously?
Yes, the film's Rodrigo is willing to cooperate with, well, the good Muslims, so to speak, because the film very clearly distinguishes between two kinds of Muslims, the kind of positive heroes who are willing to live together with the Christians, and the negative ones who call in the Moroccan kind of fanatical, very negative figures invading Spain. And of course, Rodrigo fights against these sort of bad Muslims, but is helped by the good ones. Now, this is quite interesting in terms of both the medieval realities and Franco's realities. In terms of the Middle Ages, of course, it is sort of a modern myth about medieval Spain, that there was this harmonious coexistence. And I would say there was a kind of opportunistic cooperation when it suited people. So I think we need to distinguish this from some kind of multiculturalism, because it really was not that. But, of course, Muslims and Christians very often formed alliances, and the historical Rodrigo served Muslim rulers of Zaragoza for many years and fought against Christians in the service of these Muslims. So in a kind of distorted way, the film does, in some sense, kind of refer to a medieval reality where Christians and Muslims could cooperate. But the film shows this as some kind of an idealistic collaboration. And we have, of course, that dialogue that sort of says we can give so much to each other and to Spain. So the kind of good Muslims and the good Christians.
But was he really as religiously tolerant as the movie said?
Well, this is very, very far from the medieval realities of both plundering Muslims, killing Muslims, and when opportunistic, either being in their service as a mercenary or in some military alliance with them.
Which is a good segue to the historical Rodrigo Diaz and to what Spain was like, what the Iberian Peninsula was like in the 11th century, and specifically during the lifetime of Rodrigo. So why don't you tell us a little bit about 11th century Spain, what it looked like politically, socially, about the historical backdrop?
Yes, so it was a period in the history of the Iberian Peninsula when Al-Andalus, so the Muslim part of the peninsula, fragmented up until about 1031. There was a kind of united and much, much stronger Al-Andalus. And there was a real change when so-called Taifa kingdoms, so these petty kingdoms, city-states basically, into which the once unified Al-Andalus fragmented, became very vulnerable to the Christian northern rulers and their warrior nobility. So the historian Angus Mackay famously called this protection racket. The northerners started raiding the south and then said, well, if you pay us tribute, we are not going to raid. And because it was basically impossible to prevent these raids, these rulers started to pay. They also wanted support against others. So all the Taifa rulers were afraid of each other as well, tried to take territories from the stronger ones, tried to take territories from the weaker ones. So they also created these alliances with the Christians to get their help. And so for most of the 11th century, the northerners were gathering immense tribute in gold, in precious textiles and all sorts of precious objects from the south, and then also started to take territory. And of course, Alfonso VI, who was the king Rodrigo served for a while, attached Toledo, which had a great significance for Christians because it used to be the capital of Visigothic Spain before the Arab-Berber conquest of the early 8th century. And that kind of started a panic among the Taifa rulers. It upset this order of paying tribute but being protected. So they called in the Moroccans.
And those were the Berber Almoravids who practiced a much stricter form of Islam than the Spanish Muslims. And that eventually made them a threat not only to the Christian kingdoms, but the Taifas as well.
Yes. And that started a new invasion and a kind of reunification of Al-Andalus under Moroccan rule, which then kind of set the dynamics for the coming century. So Rodrigo was basically born into and living in a society where warrior qualities were the most important ones for the nobility. They lived off of these qualities, where a lot of these nobles participated both in warfare and in looting. And of course, Rodrigo became very good at this, both extorting tribute and taking plunder, enriching himself, and ultimately being able to take over the Principality of Valencia for himself. So instead of conquering it for his king, which is what we have in the film.
For God, Alfonso, and for Spain!
Alfonso and Spain!
And that was not the case?
That was not the case, of course. He basically created an independent power base and had an independent warrior follower band that served him in exchange for plunder.
And if the Muslim South was divided into these rival principalities, these Taifa city-states, the Christian North was also divided into rival kingdoms with fluctuating borders. It was the perfect recipe for constant warfare, for constant conflict, and the perfect environment for mercenaries.
Yes, absolutely. And I should add that, of course, the Christian kingdoms were emerging and constantly sort of changing in this period. So initially, there was just one fairly small and insignificant kingdom of the Christians, that how it was called, Asturias. And then the territory under Christian rule started to grow, but also fragment, and slowly, one after the other, the kingdoms of the medieval Iberian Peninsula emerged, sort of in the 11th, 12th centuries.
Well, let's introduce our hero, or as you put it, the hero for all seasons, with the beginning of your book, where we see him for the very first time. And this is what he's doing. A group of warriors on horseback rode swiftly north to Logroña, a town at the heart of the sparsely inhabited Rioja region in the northern part of the Iberian Peninsula. They could cover a great distance without encountering any opposition. On reaching the town, they overpowered its defenders, who were no match for them, and they proceeded to pillage it. The warriors burned and looted, shedding blood as they swept through the streets and houses, destroying the town. They then devastated the rest of the region of La Rioja. These lands belonged to the Christian king Alfonso VI of Castile, who at the time, the year is 1092, was occupied waging war against the Muslims of Valencia. The army destroying King Alfonso's lands was commanded by one of the most successful mercenaries of the age, Rodrigo, or in the parlance of the times, Roy, Diaz, better known to posterity as El Cid. While raiding was a common occurrence, this particular raid elicited angry condemnation from a somewhat later chronicler, the author of the 12th century Historia Rodrigi, quote, "Most savagely and mercilessly through all these regions did he lay waste with relentless destruction, irreligious fire. He took huge booty, yet it was saddening even to tears. With harsh and impious devastation did he lay waste and destroy all the land aforesaid. He altogether stripped it of all its goods and wealth and riches, and took these for himself." End quote. What is remarkable is not that some condemned him, but that the memory of his military feats against Christians was quickly effaced and replaced by Christian adulation. Nobody could have predicted such an outcome when Rodrigo and his men ravaged La Rioja. End quote. Is that our historical Rodrigo?
He was already doing this for himself, so he was trying to secure dominion. So he hasn't yet conquered Valencia, but he was already sort of de facto the strongest power there, more than once, because he basically clearly already started creating his own power base and doing things that a loyal vassal would not be doing. Then he spent 5 years serving the Muslim ruler of Zaragoza, and he retained fairly good relations. So after this raiding of Rioja, he also went back to Zaragoza, but he was already moving around the territory of Valencia and creating forts that were his bases, and sort of taking tribute from various Muslim small rulers or lesser rulers.
What makes the raid such a good way to begin your book is that it not only introduces us to Rodrigo as the practitioner of a brutal form of warfare that targeted civilian populations, but the raid also introduces us to the political world in which the Cid operated, one that was violent and in flux. Rodrigo raided the hinterlands of Castile in retaliation for King Alfonso VI of Castile laying siege to Valencia. Valencia was a taifa state that was, at that point, still nominally under Alfonso's protection. The reason the king was attacking it had little, if anything, to do with the major, some might even say existential threat to the Christian kingdoms of Iberia, the Moroccan Almoravids. It really didn't even have much to do with the former ruler of Valencia, Alfonso's former client, Al-Qadir, who by then was firmly under the thumb of Rodrigo Diaz. The threat that led Alfonso to attack Valencia was the growing independent power of Rodrigo Diaz. And that was ironically a consequence of Rodrigo having been exiled for a second time by Alfonso. In exile, Rodrigo had built up a large personal mercenary army, and with it he continued to do what he had done in the service of kings, but now he did it to enrich himself and his followers. Al-Qadir had come to question whether Alfonso would actually protect Valencia against his enemies, especially the Moroccan Almoravids, who were at that point gobbling up the taifas as a prelude to waging war against the Iberian Christian kings. The appearance of Rodrigo and his mercenary army must have seemed like a godsend to Al-Qadir. At least at first it must have seemed like that. Rodrigo needed money to pay his troops, so he squeezed Al-Qadir even harder than Alfonso had. Al-Qadir had no alternative but to pay it. Rodrigo's demands for money forced him to impose heavy taxes on the people of Valencia, which made Al-Qadir very unpopular, and in the fall of 1092 it led to a revolt, which in turn became an opportunity for Rodrigo to take direct control over the city. But even before that, Alfonso VI had taken notice that a man whom he had exiled twice was establishing an independent power base in Valencia. I don't think he could have ignored Rodrigo, particularly after Rodrigo, on his own initiative, reconciled two of Alfonso's neighbors, the Muslim ruler of Zaragoza and the Christian king of Aragon, to form a joint alliance against Castile. The threat that led Alfonso VI to lay siege to Valencia was not the Almoravids, it was Rodrigo.
So Alfonso VI was trying to change this balance of power. Rodrigo, instead of trying to defend the area, went on the counterattack and sort of raided into the Rioja. And then eventually he did conquer Valencia. He basically starved it into submission. So the conquest wasn't some heroic battle, but mostly kind of encircling the town, starving the inhabitants until they finally opened the doors. And so this was in 1094, and he ruled Valencia until he died in 1099. So he maybe would have liked to create a kingdom, but certainly he created his own principality. And again, unlike both later medieval legend and the film, he absolutely was not interested in being the loyal vassal of Alfonso VI and was not trying to get back into the good graces of the king.
Essentially, he's a freebooter with ambitions to become more than that, to become a ruler, a legitimate ruler. In many ways, he reminds me of the Normans who went down to southern Italy in the first half of the 11th century. And by the second half of the 11th century, were no longer serving as mercenaries, but were creating their own principalities, ending up, in the case of Robert Guiscard, as being the legitimate, because he receives papal recognition. He became, by grace of God and St. Peter, Duke of Apulia and Calabria. And in the case of Roger I, he actually ends up becoming a king of Sicily. And these are guys who are no more than really mercenaries and adventurers who made good. And that looks like what the ambition of Rodrigo was.
So yes, and obviously this was a period which favored people like them, so kind of military adventurers, if you like. There are these Arabic sources about Rodrigo who suggest that he said that he wanted indeed to be the second Rodrigo, that the Muslims took the Iberian Peninsula under a Rodrigo, so the last Visigoth king, and that now here was the second who was going to sort of change this. Whether he actually said anything like this, we cannot tell, but certainly he had these ambitions, which can also be seen in the donation charter that secured the goods and properties that he gave to the bishop and bishopric of Valencia after he conquered the town. And of course, he didn't write that charter. Ecclesiastics wrote that charter, but the terminology they used and the role that they attributed to Rodrigo is already a kind of God-sent savior of the Christians of the Iberian Peninsula, and clearly a prince in his own right.
The Elcid of the movie, the Charlton Heston movie, is a considerate and just ruler of Valencia. He is someone who wants to bring together the Muslim and Christians. And what was the historical Rodrigo like when it came to ruling his new principality?
Well, certainly not the film's Rodrigo, who catapulted bread into Valencia.
Yes.
Yeah, and of course, it's impossible to tell to what extent the Arabic sources are exaggerating, because of course they are hostile to Rodrigo. So this may not be complete truth either, but they depict Rodrigo as extremely cruel, trying to find the treasures of the previous Taifa ruler, which were taken. So there were, before he conquered Valencia, there was a kind of internal coup in Valencia itself. So the Qadi, the judge, sort of took power, and Rodrigo basically tried to get the treasures, so get him to divulge where the treasures were hidden. And when he did not succeed, he had him burned alive. There's this really horrifying account by a Muslim author who claims to base this on an eyewitness account, that this Muslim judge sort of reached out. So he was put in a pit, and the burning wood was all around him, and he reached out and he pulled the burning logs closer so he would die faster to kind of end his torment. It's very hard to know exactly how Rodrigo ruled, because strangely the Christian sources are not interested in that. So even after his conquest, they basically keep enumerating his military successes and don't really say anything about what he did in Valencia. We have the donation charter, so clearly he established the bishopric and gave goods to the bishop. There are some later sources that say that he relied to some extent on Muslim and Jewish officials, and that, of course, is quite possible. But we also have texts by other Muslims who escaped Valencia, sort of bemoaning the fall of the city. So it is unlikely that he really ruled as a just and sort of impartial ruler. I mean, certainly he wanted to continue to enrich himself, ensure that his followers stay with him, and of course defend the city from new attacks.
You've already mentioned the great and very, very influential 20th century Spanish historian Ramon Menendez-Pidal. And Menendez-Pidal treats Rodrigo as the hero of the Reconquista. So let's talk a little bit about the Reconquista and how it relates, if at all, to the historic Rodrigo Diaz. As I understand it, the Reconquista is the term used for an extremely influential interpretation of Spanish history. This narrative begins with the Umayyad conquest of the Iberian Visigothic kingdom in the early 8th century. Only Asturias, the mountainous northwestern portion of the peninsula, remained in Christian hands. The Reconquista tells the story of how from this small remnant of Visigothic Spain, Christians slowly and arduously recovered the lands taken from them in a centuries-long Christian holy war that culminated in 1492 with Ferdinand and Isabella's conquest of the last Muslim kingdom, Granada, and the expulsion of the Moors from Iberia. The Reconquista plays in Spanish historiography the same role that Manifest Destiny plays in American. For Menendez-Pidal, the Reconquista was the hard-fought unification of a glorious Catholic Spanish nation and people. Quote, "The pure, unfettered religious spirit which had been preserved in the North gave impetus and national aims to the reconquest. What gave Spain her exceptional strength of collective resistance and enabled her to last through 3 long centuries of great peril was her policy of combining into one ideal the recovery of the Gothic states for the fatherland and the redemption of the enslaved churches for the glory of Christianity." End quote. This vision of Spanish history appealed greatly to the Spanish dictator General Francisco Franco, whose right-wing nationalists overthrew the Second Republic and defeated the leftist Popular Front in the bloody Spanish Civil War. Franco appropriated Menendez-Pidal's vision of the Reconquista. The Civil War became the final act of the Reconquista in which Franco himself played the role of the Cid. But to go by your study of the Cid's career, in which he fought for Muslim as well as Christian rulers, Menendez-Pidal's vision of the Reconquista doesn't seem to hold up historically. At least it doesn't for the wars of the 11th century.
Just to add to what you said, for the Francoists also, the Reconquista formed the Spanish nation and the soul of Spaniards. So it's key to all of Spanish history. And of course, this is very far from the realities. Now, because of this Francoist use and because of this distortion, some historians started to say that we should not even use the term. And the term, of course, Reconquista, is modern. It predates Franco, so it started in the 18th century, but was then especially, of course, used during the Franco period. But it's definitely, as a noun, not a medieval term. However, of course, we do have medieval texts, including this donation charter that I mentioned to the Bishopric of Valentia, but also other texts from the late 11th and 12th centuries that describe Christian conquest of various Muslim cities, lands, as some kind of recovering, restoring of land to their rightful owners, the Christians. So Reconquista does not appear, but the notion of reconquering land and that the Christians are the rightful owners of land and the Muslims invaded because the sins of the Christians, they were sort of a punishment by God sent to the Christians. And then now finally the successes of individual kings are represented as this kind of fight for Christendom. That very much appears in the medieval texts. And by the 13th century, various kings started to operate with this idea and get financial aid from the papacy. So they kind of started saying that we are fighting for Christendom. So it's not a modern idea, but I think what's very important is that in the Middle Ages, this kind of idea of retaking land coexisted with a much, much messier reality, as you said, where it was kind of indiscriminate fighting. So while you have ecclesiastics formulating this religious rhetoric and rhetoric of religious warfare, even various so-called battles of the Reconquest, where you have some sort of Christian victory, actually a lot of them are a Christian-Muslim alliance fighting against another Christian-Muslim alliance. So in no way can we actually historically see that as religious war. So I think what is really, really crucial is that in Rodrigo's age, the rhetoric, the religious rhetoric already existed, but it clearly was not the motivating factor for the warriors at the time who were willing to change sides. And of course, Rodrigo is absolutely not the only one who sometimes served Christians and other times served Muslims. We have a lot of Christian rulers who were killed by their siblings or by other Christian rulers trying to take territory from them. So yes, the realities were very much not kind of religious warfare.
But even in Rodrigo's day, and it's not coming from the secular rulers in Spain, but coming from outside of Spain. Pope Urban II, who is most famous for having launched the First Crusade, even before that was talking in terms of the need to be able to support the Christians of Spain, especially after the Almoravids arrive. Pope Urban II himself equated the wars of Christian kings to recover Christian territory in Iberia with the Crusades to recover Jerusalem, and he assured Spanish Christians that they would receive the same indulgence and remission of sins as he had promised to Crusaders to the East. Quote, "If the warriors of other provinces propose to aid the churches in Asia and to liberate their brothers from the tyranny of the Saracens, so should you, Spanish rulers. If any one of you, therefore, plans to go to Asia, let him try to fulfill the desire of his devotion at home. For there is no virtue in delivering Christians from Saracens there, while exposing Christians here to the tyranny and oppression of the Saracens." End quote. And by the middle of the 12th century, the Reconquista became explicitly a crusading movement. Pope Calixtus II, at the First Lateran Council in 1123, pronounced that the Spanish wars against the Muslims were meritorious in the same way as wars against Muslims in the East. The Reconquista may not have begun as a proto-crusade, but apparently the papacy was attempting to turn it into one.
Yeah, so there are debates about the original impetus, or who influenced whom. So there are some who think that the rhetoric that appears in the Iberian Peninsula about this kind of retaking of Christian land influenced the papacy in formulating the idea of the crusade. And others think that the crusade idea sort of arrived in the Iberian Peninsula and sort of influenced the rhetoric about the wars. And of course, it is certainly true that, as you said, eventually the Iberian Peninsula is just sort of declared one of the theaters of crusade. The indulgences, it depends. Sometimes the popes give equal indulgence, and other times they want to encourage people to go to the East when there are big crises, and then they kind of withdraw these equal indulgences. But certainly the Iberian Peninsula becomes kind of a crusading theater. I think local understandings in Rodrigo's period, there were already, of course, links to the papacy and sort of importing the Roman liturgy, replacing the Visigothic liturgy. So there were certainly, contacts, and the Cluniacs were coming to the Iberian Peninsula. So it's very difficult to really trace exactly how these influences kind of moved around.
Okay, so we have a successful mercenary who fights a very brutal type of warfare. How does this individual, and why does this individual get so completely transformed over the ages? How does he turn into the hero of that movie?
I think it's a very long process, and there are different groups and people who take part in this process, and they all have their own aims. I think it probably started with his widow and daughters. And of course, we don't have very good evidence for their actual role in the creation of the myth. What we do know is that Jimena decided to take Rodrigo's body when they had to evacuate Valencia. So 3 years after Rodrigo's death, in the end, Valencia was so deep in Muslim territory, they were unable to hold it any longer. They had to evacuate and go north to Castile.
But it's interesting that 3 years after, for 3 years, Valencia was held by his widow.
Yes, exactly. So she was no sort of doe-eyed, submissive woman waiting passively for Rodrigo. That's kind of also one of the big myths in the film. She, like other aristocratic women at the time, clearly was actively involved in governing. Once she became a widow, we have charters. She even signed the charter just as Rodrigo had signed his. She orders her vassals and her sons-in-law to respect her wishes. So, yeah, I mean, she was really a ruler in her own right. But after 3 years, she had to evacuate, and she decided to take Rodrigo's body with her and have it reburied at the monastery of San Pedro de Cardeña. And his daughters, through their marriage, became mothers of sort of future lines of kings. So kings of Navarre, kings of Castile, eventually came sort of from this lineage. So I think that there was this attempt at, well, if you like, dynastic myth building, creating an ancestor who was much purer and a more positive figure and sort of suitable for the slightly later period also for his descendants. There was the monastery, San Pedro de Cardeña, which is associated to a lot of the early texts. The Cantar de Miocid, there are debates about whether it was written at the monastery or just influenced in some way by the monastery, but certainly in the Cantar, Rodrigo's links to the monastery appear to be much, much stronger. So it's not just that he's buried there eventually, but he's represented as having various ties in life and leaving his wife and daughters in the care of the abbot when he goes into exile and so on. So San Pedro is mentioned several times in the Cantar. Then you have other texts in the 13th century, the so-called legend of Cardeña, which doesn't survive on its own, but it was incorporated into these histories of Spain that were written at the royal court, the Historia de España, which is a text which has a lot of the best-known myths about Rodrigo, including that he had this victory over the Muslims in death, so that his dead body was strapped onto his horse. That comes from this 13th century legend. The monks of San Pedro tried to have Rodrigo canonized as a saint, and they treated his body as a saint. They did various building works, creating a chapel where he and Jimena were buried, but also they claimed many, many members of their extensive family, including non-existent people. So this cult kind of kept growing. And in the 18th century, when they renovated the monastic church and the facade of the monastery, they had this huge equestrian statue of Rodrigo put on the facade, following the model of Santiago Matamoros. So this idea of the apostle St. James killing the Moors, this became the kind of model for representing Rodrigo. Then there were all sorts of literary texts about him. And of course, it's very hard to trace some of these. So there are oral ballads that we know from the late medieval period, which started to associate him, for example, to the oath of Santa Gadea. So this idea that he imposed an oath on Alfonso VI that he had nothing to do with his brother's murder. A complete, again, myth that there's no evidence from Rodrigo's lifetime of anything like this. And then eventually sort of picked up. So he was transformed into this perfect knight in the context of the 13th century, when in the first half of the 13th century, of course, the papacy was doing its best to have the various kings of the Iberian Peninsula unite and wage war together against the Muslims, leading to the victory of Las Navas de Tolosa. So he probably was a very good figure for that, to kind of the mythic Rodrigo of the Cantar, who's loyal to the king and who fights for the faith. So that kind of propagated the idea of him as this Christian hero. That got picked up in literature even outside Spain. We mentioned Corneille, but of course, everyone had their Germany, in England, eventually in the United States. Everyone was picking up on this literary figure. So I think it's sort of the snowball effect of once you have someone who's represented as this ideal hero, then the ideals of every subsequent age are sort of hung on to him and transform him even further.
He reminds me a lot of Roland. You have the Song of Roland, which presents us with a hero who has no relationship at all to the little bit that we know about the historic person who underlies that myth. The only thing we know about the historical Roland was that he served as Charlemagne's prefect of the Breton marches and was among those killed in a Basque ambush of Charlemagne's baggage train in 778 as Charlemagne withdrew from his Spanish campaign. By the late 11th century, Roland had become Charlemagne's nephew and greatest warrior, and the hero of a chanson in which he appears as a proto-crusader. The story of Roland was subsequently adapted and added to throughout the Middle Ages, not only in France, but in Germany, Spain, and especially Italy, where he was renamed Orlando. This climaxed in an immensely popular romantic epic poem, Orlando Furioso, The Fury of Orlando, by the early 16th century Italian poet Ludovico Ariosto. The Orlando of that work, who bears little resemblance to the Roland of the chanson and has nothing to do with the shadowy historical Roland, became the subject of operas and, oddly, at least 2 science fiction novels. The difference between Roland and Rodrigo is, as you show in your book, we know enough about the historical Rodrigo that you were able to trace his transformation over the centuries from a highly successful mercenary into the hero of Spanish nationalism. What is similar is that in the 18th and 19th centuries, the Roland of the chanson also became a symbol of nationalism, of French nationalism. I think both are examples of how emerging nation states sought the roots of national identity in the Middle Ages by going back to those heroes. So you have the Song of Roland for France, you have the Nibelungenlied for Germany, and you have the Cantar or the Poema for Spain.
Yes, and I think actually for Spain this is quite interesting because the Cantar is the first long epic poem that survives, but there are other epic poems, including Fernán González, who was this kind of first Count of Castile, who also became a kind of mythical figure as a founder of Castile, and kind of attributing to him a role that he did not have historically.
Yes.
And initially, I think there were many other figures, and perhaps he was not even the most famous, because there is this line in one of the poems saying that there are those who say that Alvar Fáñez was kind of the first and the Cid was the second, but that's not the case. So one wonders whether there was a kind of literary rivalry initially. But yeah, he definitely won if there was a rivalry. And of course, this is to a large part due to Ramón Menéndez Pidal. The Cantar was known already in at the end of the 16th century. It was already copied. Various scholars studied it. So it's not Menéndez Pidal who discovered it, but he really dedicated a lot of time to trying to prove that it was authentic, that it was written down only about 40 years after Rodrigo's death and went back to authentic oral tradition. So he really sort of transformed the status of this text, and not just of the text, but of Rodrigo. Menéndez Pidal was writing in sort of the early 20th century. He was arguing against other scholars, Orientalists who worked based on Arabic sources, and other historians who didn't really believe in this mythic Cid. So there were already works before him, both critical of the Cid and saying that he was a mercenary and kind of sticking fairly close to the Muslim sources, and those who even doubted his historical existence. So quite amusingly, actually, there were people who thought that there was no such person at all. And Menéndez Pidal thought that he had to rescue the real Cid from these people who were defaming him, and then sort of restore him to the status that he truly deserved, and saw him not just as a historical figure who was a positive historical figure, but somebody who would be a model in his own lifetime and give some sort of direction to people. And of course, we have to understand that he was writing in a context that was the end of the Spanish Empire, the very humiliating defeat of 1898, of this crisis in Spain where different factions, different groups existed who had very different ideas of how to modernize Spain or how to regain the greatness of Spain, which of course eventually led to the Civil War and Franco's victory. So Menendez Pidal started writing about this really absolutely in a way that was really adulation. So, I mean, he tried to write scholarship, but even in that period when historians, of course, wrote in a very different style, if you read that text, it's really he's in love with his hero, and he's just sort of seeing him everything the Cid does, he tries to account for as somehow positive and justified action.
But one of the parts of the myth that is really interesting that didn't make it into the movie is the dishonoring and abuse of the Cid's daughters. So do you want to talk a little bit about that and what the point of that story is?
Yes. So in the Cantar, which has a tripartite structure, the third part is all about how after the reconciliation with Alfonso VI, so in this version, the king finally recognizes that he made a mistake, that he was unjust in exiling Rodrigo, and pardons him and restores him fully to his status and honor, and proposes this marriage for his daughters with the Infantes de Carrion, who are imaginary figures as in the shape that they appear. So there were nobles of Carrion in reality, but they were not royal heirs. They were not infantes. Yes. And so according to the story, these infantes are very horrible people who basically scheme to marry his daughters because they see his rise and want to get riches and honor in this way. But they're cowards, and they sort of prove this cowardice twice, both in a battle against Muslims and in a rather funny episode when a lion breaks out of its cage, and they sort of flee and hide under the bed and behind sort of barrels. And when they are mocked for this cowardice, and even sort of just their knowledge that their cowardice has been revealed, makes them incredibly vengeful, and their idea is that they will take vengeance on the Cid's daughters. And of course, this is in sync with medieval ideas of honor and dishonor through the bodies of women. Yes. So they come up with this plan to say that they want to take their wives back to their own lands. So far after the marriage, they were staying with the Cid and living there. But now they announce their intention to take their wives home with them. And then in an oak wood, they tell the entourage, this whole party that rides with them, to go ahead because they want to just sort of dally with their wives in this wood. And then they tie them up and take their clothes off and beat them and basically leave them for dead. And one of the loyal men of the Cid has doubts about this whole thing, so he kind of doesn't go very far, and then he goes back looking for the women and then rescues them. And from this point on, the Cid wants justice from the king, saying that it was the king who came up with this idea of marrying his daughters to these people. And eventually he gains full justice, and the daughters are married to even better husbands. It's, from a modern perspective, it's all quite horrendous, but from a medieval one, it's kind of full vindication. Now, it's very strange why you would have this whole story in a text that wants to celebrate a hero. I should say that the Cid's historical daughters are totally effaced in this text, even to the point where the names of these two daughters, Elvira and Sol, are not the historical names of. And we know that Rodrigo's daughters were called Maria and Cristina. So the text totally changes everything, even their names. But various scholars speculated about why you would have this, and the most convincing to me seems to be that this is based on literary models. And there were these French romances about women who are innocent, but they are maligned and sometimes cast out and eventually sort of triumph and show their innocence. You also, of course, have saints' lives where some women are mistreated and, of course, even killed. Tortured, and even killed. So probably these influence this text in creating this completely fictional story.
And in the story, the Infantes abuse their wives in order to take revenge upon and to dishonor the Cid. The unfortunate women are merely tools of revenge.
Well, that's the intention to really dishonor him. But of course, in the end, it fails because his champions eventually fight against the Infantes and defeat them, and the Infantes.
The judgment of God. So now that you studied the Cid and you studied how he's been transformed, now is he relevant to our age? And if he is, what do we learn from studying about this historical figure and the legend that grew up around him?
So, according to many people, he is relevant in that today the far-right party Vox refers to him many times. But on the other hand, multiculturalists also refer to him. So both sides seem to want to create some sort of an ancestor, in a sense, a model, and sort of claim him, the historical Rodrigo, as kind of either a supremacist who wanted to kill Muslims, or as this wonderful person who collaborated and sort of lived with and learned from Muslims. As I hope I have argued that neither image is historical reality. And I would also argue against the relevance of Rodrigo today, because I think we cannot, in a sense, translate medieval realities for our own times. And so when we go back to the medieval historical reality of a person who was an opportunistic warrior who killed and plundered, what sort of a model can this be? So the myths, of course, can be turned into models, but the reality, I don't think so. So I think what we can learn, in a sense, is why and how different groups, different people take up a historical figure, what they see in him and how they transform him to serve their own purposes. And then perhaps the biggest lesson is that we have to be very, very skeptical of such enterprises and try to go back to see what these people who supposedly are heroes for this or that group, population, country, etc., what exactly did they actually do, and then sort of face that historical reality, and I think draw the only possible conclusion that we cannot base our own lives and models of behavior on these past historical figures.
I agree with you completely about that. I think that is the perfect way to end this episode. Again, thank you. This has been really a pleasure for me, and I've learned a lot from your book, and it was great to meet you. So
very nice to talk to you, and thank you very much for taking on single-handedly the podcasting job.
Well, we are out of time, so it's bye for now.